So what we're going to do now is we're going to go and fetch those values that our API server is providing, and we're going to display them in our Angular client app. So what we're going to do is we're going to use one of our shiny new extensions to create a new component inside our app folder. And what we can do is we can just right click, and in our context menu here we've got the option to generate a component. And the ones down here that all start with generate, these are the ones that are related to Angular. And we've got a couple up here that are related to our C# extensions. But when we're in our Angular project, we want to focus on these ones. So I'm just going to click on generate component, and then we just give our component a name. Now this one we're just going to call value. It's all in lowercase, as that's the convention for Angular components. And then we just press return. And this goes ahead and creates this value component for us. And if we go and take a look at what this has done for us, then it's created 4 files inside here. We've got our CSS file, the HTML file, there's a spec.ts file which is used for testing. And testing is not something we're going to be covering on this course, but this file is included as well. And then we get our component.ts file. Now when we created this particular component, it's been given a selector of app-value. And this is what we specify when we want to display this component's view. And we've also got our value component HTML and the CSS as well for this particular component. Now when we create a new component, we have to declare it in our app-module.ts file. But when we use that utility to create this particular component, then inside app-module.ts, it's automatically added this to our declarations. And it's also added the import inside here so that we're bringing in our value.component inside this file. Now our goal here is to go out and get the data from our API. So what we need to do is we need to make use of the HTTP client service that Angular provides as part of the framework. Now if we just go back to the package.json very briefly, the HTTP client module actually comes inside the Angular common package that we have inside our dependencies. And this is what we're going to need to add in order to make use of the HTTP client service that it provides. So inside our app-module.ts, what we need to do is we actually need to bring in the HTTP client module into the import section of the ng module. So what we'll do, and this is where sometimes VS Code is great, sometimes it's not so great. So what we'll do is we'll start typing HTTP client, and no, it doesn't exist inside our auto imports. And sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't. But the problem is with VS Code and automatically importing, it's not so great at taking a look and indexing everything that's inside this node modules folder. And it simply doesn't do it. Or it does sometimes, and it all depends. Sometimes it will work and sometimes it won't. I don't have a good explanation of the specifics of this, but there are occasions where we'll simply have to come up to the top of our file and we'll have to import it manually. So I'm just going to import the Angular client module, and we're going to get this from Angular/common/HTTP. And now we've got this brought in to our Angular application, we can make use of this in our new value component. So let's just open up the value component.ts. And what we want to do is we're going to use dependency injection inside our Angular project to bring in the HTTP client so that we can use this to call our API. And the way that we do this is we add this inside our constructor. So I'm going to say private HTTP, and then we need to use HTTP client as what we're going to use to go and get our values. Now be careful when automatically importing with VS Code, because now that we've brought in our HTTP client module, we do have access to bring in automatically the HTTP client. However, there's more than one of them that's available for import, and we want to take the one that's from Angular Common HTTP. If you choose the other one from Selenium, then it's not going to work. So we want to make sure and be careful that we select the correct import and make sure it's been brought in at the top of this particular file. Now once we have access to this HTTP client, we can make HTTP requests to our API server. Now inside this constructor, the one that we created, this implements the onInit interface. And each Angular component has several lifecycle events where we can do something at a particular point. Now the constructor comes first, and this is normally considered too early to do something such as making an API call. But it is the right place to inject a service that we want to use in our component. So when we initialize this component, it injects the HTTP client and we have this available for our use. And what we also want to do is when this component initializes, and inside this ng onInit lifecycle method is when we'll actually make our call to the API. But what we'll do is we'll create a method to do this, and we'll create a method called getValues. And this doesn't take any arguments. And what we'll say is we'll say list.http to make use of our HTTP client, and then we can choose one of the options that we want to use to make this request. Now we're going to make a HTTP GET request, so we'll choose HTTP GET, and then we just need to provide the address or the route to our API endpoint. Now what we're going to do here is very simply just get our values back from the server. So we're going to do what we did in Postman and just specify localhost 5000 /API/values. Now we're not always going to hard code the address of our API in here, but just for the short term and just to keep things simple, we're just going to add it hard coded as the address to go and get. Now if we take a look at the get methods and we take a look at its description about what it does. So first of all, it takes a URL as a string. Potentially it could take some options as well, which we could add to our HTTP headers. We don't need to on this occasion. But if we scroll down and take a look at its description, this constructs a GET request that interprets the body as a JSON object and returns the response body as a JSON object. Okay. But what this returns to us is an observable of the response body as a JSON object. Now, whenever we want to make use of an observable, and in order to get the contents of this observable out, we need to subscribe to the observable. And an observable is a stream of data that we're getting from our API. But in order to execute this particular request and get what's inside the observable, we need to subscribe to the observable. So I'm going to type in subscribe and then open up the parentheses, and then we see the different options we have to use with this subscribe. And the one that we want to use, there's a number of deprecated options inside here, but we want to use this fifth overload, which is not deprecated. And the first argument we have in here is what to do next, what to do when we receive this observable. Now this takes a function where we pass in the object that we're getting back from our server, so this is going to be our response. And it's a function that doesn't return a value. So what we'll do is we'll say the response object is what we're getting back from our server. And in this expression, we'll open up some curly brackets. And what we also want to do inside this component is declare a class property of what we're going to store the response back from the server in. So what I'm going to do is just declare a class property of values. And for the time being, we'll give this a type of any. Now, any in TypeScript makes this values property equivalent to just any normal JavaScript variable. It doesn't have any type safety, and we can put whatever we want inside this values property. So what I'm going to do is after we get our response back from the server, I'm going to say list.values equals our response. And when we get the response back from our server, this is going to contain the object with our values inside that we're getting back from our API. What we also want to do inside here is after the response, we want to check to see if there's an error. Because we're making a call to our API, there's always potential for something to go wrong. And inside the error, all we'll do is we'll just say console.log and then pass in the error so that we can take a look at it if there's a problem. And with this method in place, what we can do is when our component initializes, we can call this method and then we'll get the values populated with the response back from the server. So I'll say list.getValues to call the method when our component initializes. So what we'll do now is we'll take a look at our HTML template, and this is going to give us an opportunity to try out another one of our extensions we've installed. So warm up your fingers to test out this shortcut, and if you're on a Mac, then we want to use Shift, Alt and O, and this is going to take us to our HTML template. If you're on Windows, it's just Alt and O. Or I should say Shift, Option and O if I'm on a Mac. And what we can do is use that shortcut key to switch to our HTML template. If it's not open, it's going to open it up. And just give your fingers a little workout and just switch between the CSS file, which is I, and the component, which is U, back to CSS, which is I, and then O is to open up the HTML. So just give your little fingers a workout and just practice switching between the components, because getting used to this little shortcut will really speed you up as you transition between these components. And what we're looking at here is the amazing content that's going to be displayed when we show our values component. So all we've got in here is a little paragraph saying value works. And what we want to do is we're not going to actually display our values right now, because now we've got the method in to go and get the values. We can just take a look in our Chrome developer tools to make sure that we're getting the values back. But what we need to do in order to achieve that is we actually need to display our component. And the way that we can do that is by using the component selector. And we'll add this to our app component page. So another shortcut that's worth getting used to is Command and P to search for a file. And the one that I want to open up in this occasion is the app component HTML. And what we'll do is we'll just get rid of some of the noise that's inside here. We don't need all of these links or the unordered list here or the H2. So I'm just going to remove those. And we also don't need this image either. So I'm just going to remove that. And what we want to do is display our value component on our app component HTML. So what I can do, if I just start typing app, then what we should see in here is some IntelliSense to get our new component. In this case, it's the app value. So I can just press tab to select this and then tab again to create the opening and closing selectors for our app component. Now what we'll need to do is we'll need to make sure that our API server is started. So if it isn't started, then just use .NET Watch Run to go ahead and start this. In another tab, let's start our Angular application. So I'm just going to cd into dating app -spar and just type in ng-serve. And once this is up and running, let's go and take a look at our browser. So I'm just going to refresh the page. And if I go to the console, then what we can see inside here is we've actually got an error. And if I take a look at the errors, then what it's telling us is that our request has been blocked because no access control allow origin header is present on a requested resource. Now this has not come as a big surprise to myself because I was expecting this, and what we need to do is address this particular problem. And this is a browser security feature that's protecting us from accessing data where it's from an unknown origin. Now our client application is running on port 4200. Our API server is running on port 5000. So our Angular application is in a different domain. And as far as our Angular application is concerned, this could be anywhere. It could be some nasty site.com that's trying to infect our client browser with malicious nonsense. And in order for our browser to trust this particular site, then we need to configure a CORS policy. And that's what this is telling us. Now, if we look at the network tab, then what we should see is we're also getting a failed request in here as well. What this used to do was actually give us the data anyway, and we used to be able to just go ahead and preview what we're getting back from the server. But modern browsers now don't even let us see the data inside the developer tools until we've got our CORS policy configured. So what we're going to do next is we're going to take a look back at our API and we're going to set up a CORS policy so that we can actually return our values from our server to our client application.